Well, good afternoon and welcome to a Prospect Live event, Building a Just Economy, insights from leaders, activists, innovators in the worker center movement. My name is Harold Meyerson. I am the editor-at-large of the American Prospect. I'm someone who's been covering workers and immigrant workers and the American labor movement since, I think, the days of Samuel Gompers and Emma Lazarus. It gets a little fuzzy. Today, we're going to be spending the next 80 or 90 minutes or thereabouts talking to the visionaries, the innovators, the activists, the doers, people who have done the impossible, who have organized workers who people said couldn't be organized into a range of alt labor or worker center organizations. We're talking about people who've organized domestic workers, who've organized fry cooks in the backs of obscure little restaurants, who have organized the day laborers who are going to be rebuilding our communities after Hurricane Ida passes through them. Very important people, essential workers who've left out of many of the legal protections and rights afforded to other workers. But over the last 20 years, movements have arisen to give those workers power, to change the labor standards laws to include them. Very significant achievement. So we're going to be talking about that today with a number of people who have actually done that work. And we're going to begin by my talking to two extraordinary people who have been around this work and instrumental in its success over the last 20 some years. We're joined by Laine Romero-Alston, who was an activist and then went to the Solidago Foundation and the Ford Foundation and now the Open Society Foundation, and had a real role in shaping what this movement became and in helping fund it. And many of you also know Sarita Gupta from her previous work with Jobs with Justice, one of the first and most innovative worker support organizations, and who is now at the Ford Foundation, heading up not really the future of work, but the future of workers for the Ford Foundation. I should add that this event is co-sponsored by the American Prospect, on whose website, www.prospect.org, you can read a great overview piece by Laine and Sarita about worker centers, and many other pieces too, including today an oral history of Pablo Alvarado. It's co-sponsored by the Prospect, by the Ford Foundation, by the Open Society Foundation, and by the University of Illinois Chicago Center for Urban Economic Development, which has been crucial really to studying what works, what hasn't worked, and all kinds of such things with worker centers. So let's begin by my talking with Laine and Sarita. And why did the Ford Foundation and Open Society want to do this project now? What about this moment? And let's begin with Laine.
Thanks so much, Harold, and I just want to thank you so much for all of your work in this realm since the time of Emma Lazarus and before, but your partnership in this, and it's just really exciting to be here and with so many people joining us out in the YouTube land. We're so happy to be here with you. Let me just start by saying that both Sarita, who's been a huge partner of mine over many years in this work, and I have been accompanying the worker center field and movement really for 2 decades plus now. And when we entered the fields as organizers and advocates, it was a time of really seismic change in the global economy. Just to give a little perspective of where this field came out of. Neoliberal policies of free trade and structural adjustments were really accelerating outsourcing in this country to other places like Mexico and then Asia and other parts of Latin America. And we saw what our friends now at the DOL called the tremendous fissuring of work, or really the breaking up of the working relationship as it was known. At this time, we also saw just a huge growth in what we know or we call in this world the low-wage labor market. And we particularly saw this in the growth of service sectors of the economy. So restaurants and retail, construction, as well as the aging baby boomers generation and the huge growth in the need for care, both of our children and our parents and other loved ones. So as a result of this, what we talk about the restructuring of the economy that was happening in the 80s and the 90s globally as well, there was also a tremendous growth of people migrating from Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa looking for work and economic survival. And essentially, in short, workers were struggling to make work and make ends meet. And this particularly played out for folks who've been traditionally left out. So low-income communities, women, people of color, and immigrants. And frankly, the tools that we had at that time, whether it be labor law, protections, exacerbated by a broken immigration system, weren't able to keep up with the changing nature of work and the changing nature of this workforce that I talked about. And frankly, the worker organizations that were established in the frameworks for collective bargaining that were established to protect workers really were not able to extend to a lot of the segments of and sectors, but also were not, frankly, at that time organizing generally. Of course, there were this workforce, and particularly immigrant workers. And it was in this context that we saw the emergence of the worker centers in the 80s and 90s. And I guess I've been really fortunate, frankly, first from the field and then from philanthropy, as you said, to be working with the growth, particularly early 2000s on of this field. Many of the leaders that you will hear from today and the stories that they will share, and seeing the capacity of this field just grow tremendously, things that folks said were not possible. And I was particularly lucky to come to Ford in 2011 that was able to put forward the resources to help those organizations scale at that time, that we'll hear about that. And it was at that time we said, and particularly now with the opportunities, that we said we need a moment to take stock, to step back, to celebrate, but also learn from the insights of the past to orient the future. And then finally, before I let Sarita finish and take it from here, that was also this event, and also the library, the Worker Center Library we are launching today with Nick and Beth, who have been huge parts of this, this project, and that will house a series of reports, and that is meant to be a living resource for our work going forward.
And that'll be at the University of Illinois Chicago Center for Urban Economic Development.
Thank you.
Sarita, what's your take on all this?
Yeah, well, I think I'll just build right on what Laine shared, which is, the why now is really about celebrating the achievements of this movement, as you shared a bit on top there, Harold. It's important to acknowledge that worker centers have played a critical role in winning rights and raising standards in low-wage industries. They've been instrumental in raising the minimum wage, enforcing wage theft ordinances, winning paid leave policies, and securing protections for immigrant workers. And they are playing a critical role now. During this pandemic and moment of racial reckoning, we've seen consciousness change in the broader public about workers in low-wage sectors. The importance, we hear people talk about the importance of protections and rights for essential workers. In many respects, the worker center movement has primed this moment by raising the consciousness, and they've laid the groundwork for solutions. They've really pushed the dialogue about what we should expect out of work in the economy. And they're informing and shaping federal policies today that advance a more inclusive set of labor and social protections that benefit all working people.
Right. Now, the movement has risen alongside the traditional labor movement, Sarita, and there's a history there of varying relationships over time, and that's changed over time. Why don't you talk about that for a moment, too?
Sure, happy to. Well, in the past decade, worker centers have forged partnerships with unions, some of which had previously viewed the centers skeptically or even antagonistically. And certainly the article you mentioned that Laine and I co-authored goes in a little bit more depth about these partnerships. So I won't do that here, but I will say that it's really worth noting that the labor movement itself has changed a great deal in the last 2 decades. The labor movement did complete 180 on its immigration position. And under the leadership of the late Richard Trumka, the AFL-CIO forged new partnerships with the Worker Center movement. Numerous dedicated staff at the Federation have encouraged joint organizing and membership efforts. And we know this work will continue to grow under the new leadership of President Schuler. In addition, we've seen growing numbers of unions develop and grow these relationships, whether it's LIUNA to SEIU, to the iron workers, to steel workers, and many more. But we're also living in a moment of real reckoning when it comes to race and gender equity and immigration. And from the beginning, intersectionality has been in the DNA of worker centers. Or groups like Endelon and National Domestic Workers Alliance are part of the immigrant rights movement. Or when you look at NDWA and ROC and the National Black Worker Center, they're all part of the gender justice and racial justice movements. So I think people who are committed to building an inclusive labor movement know that we need to move beyond symbolic representation of people of color and women, and we really need to center the experiences of Black and Brown workers and the experiences of workers based on their gender identity. And this is really what it means to center racial and gender equity in our movement work. And so that means we can no longer outsource this work to others. We can no longer sideline these issues to those of constituency groups only. We actually have an immense opportunity right now to build a future labor movement that will embrace different approaches and engage in deepened partnerships and meaningfully invest in this work. And now in my role at the Ford Foundation, I have the great privilege of supporting these partnerships to help take them to the next level, building on the legacy of Laine and others who over the last 2 decades made meaningful investments in this field, supporting ideas, individuals, and institutions to meet this very moment that we're in now.
Well, let's meet some of those individuals and institutions that you were just talking about, Sarita. I know we're going to have a series of panels, and beginning right now, we have one that's you and Laine will be talking to some of the key founders and activists in that movement. So let's move right now to that.
Wonderful. Sorry, we're still in the pandemic unmute mess up zone. So wonderful. Thank you, Harold. And I have the privilege and also the challenge of taking us into this next part of the event, moderating really a story in 3 parts that are told by many of the leaders and architects of the Worker Center movement. And honestly, this is an impossible task. Each of these folks could have 90 minutes, if not multiple days, to tell the story. And there's so many others who have been part of the story, many who are listening in, including those who have and are working to build strong organizations at bases at the local level or in other sectors and in roles not included on this panel. The reality is the Worker Center field has always started at the base, from the local to the regional, the national and sectoral, and even into the global and transnational. And this is true for the leaders included on this first panel, which I'm excited to turn to now. And welcome Jen Pu from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Pablo Alvarado from the National Day Labor Organizing Network, Lola Cuevas Smallwood from the UCLA Labor Center, the LA Black Worker Center, and the National Black Worker Center Network, and Sarita, who you know, but she's gonna firmly put her hat of 20 years of work in the movement at the National Jobs with Justice. So thanks you all for joining. Pablo, I'm going to turn to you first. As Endelon is really the longest standing of the National Worker Center networks and some of the first worker centers that were established at the local level across the country. And interestingly, if you look across sectors and geographies during the time when you were creating the Worker Center movement, similar models emerged around the same time in the early years. They weren't really heavily networked, but they had common characteristics. And so you were clearly seeing something and responding to something similar. So what was happening that demanded the particular response and model? And just to add on, could you speak particularly, picking up on what Sarita said, to how and why Endelon chose to engage with and build partnerships with unions particularly in a moment when that was challenging, given the tensions of the day related to immigrant workers.
Thank you, Laine. Buenas tardes, todos y todas. The majority of the 70 day labor centers that exist in the US and our connections with the labor movement as a whole have developed as a result of complex relationship with unions, sometimes relationships of support, hostility, abandonment, indifference, and often at the same time. And I'm afraid 5 minutes is not enough to describe such complexity. Let me share some ideas here. We began organizing worker centers out of necessity. Unions had abandoned day laborers. Building trades had abandoned residential construction. Unions were finding it, every time more difficult to organize workers in growing sectors. The structure of jobs and industry was changing rapidly. Government enforcement of labor standards was and continues to be inadequate. Wage theft, workplace injuries, violence, discrimination, and other abuses were rampant when we began creating some of these worker centers. And immigrant workers, Black workers, and women workers were bearing the burden of these abuses. So we began and continued to organize under the same principles and practices and beliefs the unions have. Number one, lasting change comes from the bottom up. 2, self-determination. We were tired of intermediaries speaking for us, tired of being used as political footballs. Number 3, a rising tide lifts all boats. 4, taking wages out of competition. That's why worker centers have their own minimum wage standards. And this is exactly what persuaded unions to help us. In fact, our AFL-CIO partnership agreement was born out of a complex crisis where some building trade unions specifically wanted to ban day labor centers, while others were supporting us. And based on this crisis, we were able to turn the tide. In the late 90s, for instance, a group of day laborers were escorted out of the AFL-CIO convention in Los Angeles. Half a decade later, AFL-CIO former President John Sweeney, may he rest in peace, was welcoming day laborers and other low-wage workers to the main stage. Ironically, as I think back, many in foundations and in academia were writing about how the labor movement was dying and declining and how worker centers were the new hot thing in town. And unions need to learn from worker centers, it was often said. Many years later, as I reflect back, I think that the warnings about the decline of labor were accurate, no doubt. But unions don't necessarily need to emulate worker centers. I think it's the other way around. Worker centers need to emulate unions more. Specifically, we need to emulate the unions that started the labor movement. Those unions who were truthful to the theory and practice of bottom-up change, as opposed to top-down change. We need to emulate those unions who never gave up their commitment to self-determination, that believed that workers speak for themselves, not be spoken for. Part of the reason why, for example, the immigrant rights debate has become so awful and recognizably is because immigrants are caught in a trap where they either receive scorn from Fox News or pity on MSNBC. And that is, if we're lucky, on a good day. Absent is the empowered voice of migrants themselves, totally absent. People speak about us without us at the table. Yes, the worker centers were born out of necessity, but they were also born as a demand for self-determination, for respect, for good wages and working conditions. And in most instances, these demands were articulated by undocumented immigrant workers who stood in public spaces looking for work so they could support their families. They faced threats of retaliation. They faced threats of deportation. And in this sense, they're just like the restaurant workers, the domestic workers, the garment workers, and many other workers who keep this country going. And this is the courage that workers still possessed. This is the power that I believe that the unions that started the labor movement tapped into. And I only hope that the existence of worker centers and our great victories serve as a reminder to all unions about their own genesis.
Thank you so much for that, Pablo. I really appreciate you grounding us in that origin story and for all your work and that of your members. That's a good segue to Lola. Lola, there's a long history of Black worker organizing and leadership in the labor movement, without a doubt. And yet you and others, and I want to do a shout out to Stephen Pitts right now, focused on the need for the worker center movement specifically, which was largely, as Pablo said, immigrant focused, to build specific leadership and infrastructure among and led by Black workers. Can you tell us why and how that evolved over the last decade?
Thank you so much, Laine, for inviting us to be part of this conversation, and Pablo for that great analysis. And I want to lift up the immigrant worker centers who really embraced and made space for the Los Angeles Black Worker Center, which was the first Black worker center in California and the first of a string of Black worker centers to emerge across the country, totaling now about a dozen worker centers that fall under the banner of the National Black Worker Center Network. But it was, in our origin story, it was really about how do we create an opportunity for Black workers to come together through their authentic leadership in their communities, whether they be unemployed or underemployed, formerly incarcerated, Black immigrant workers, but recognizing that our communities were trapped in this cycle of unemployment and underemployment. And the work, really began with workers coming together and including faith leaders and civil rights leaders and saying, how do we build access to quality jobs for Black workers? How do we build discrimination-free work sites and workplaces that employ our communities? And how do we improve those jobs that Black workers were in? When we began, the narrative was really about, the economy being rigged and in the 40 years that this country has, where workers have lost their gains, right? But Black workers really had a very deeper story, right? Their story was rooted more in the conversation and the experiences of dealing with a racialized economy, rooted in racial capitalism, where Black workers and their families for generations dealing with the effects of racism, enduring racism in public policies, employer biases, institutional practices that really created the perfect storm of disparities for Black workers. And particularly when we began looking at the worker center model back in 2008 and 9. And we, at the time when we launched the Worker Center, even though we were in Los Angeles, which was sort of this revival of union organizing and ground zero for what was termed as a new economy, Black folks made up about 8% of the population, but we were 45% of the homeless population. We were 50% of those incarcerated in jail, and about 45% of folks who were in this, living on the streets and fighting for housing. And we knew that the only way that we could address this issue, right, as workers coming together, was to not focus on what had been a traditional model of worker training. Let's just train Black workers out of this problem. We knew that we had to focus on building and organizing workers. And unions, Black labor leaders stepped up to the table to support that. Immigrant Worker Center stepped up to support this, really understanding that we could not have multi-ethnic alliance around economic justice unless Black workers were organized. And this was before Black Lives Matters, right? This was, there was a lot of ridicule for why do you need a Black Worker Center? But I think in the end, what our members demonstrated was that when we have strong Black workers, we have strong Black communities. And when we have strong Black communities, we have a stronger Los Angeles. And our workers put their voices and bodies on the line, fighting and winning the largest minimum wage policy in the nation, building and supporting the first project labor agreement with targeted local hire, with a mandate, right, that Black workers have access to those jobs and opportunities. And it was very difficult in our conversations with unions, to Pablo's point, right? We struggled together, but in the end, we came to understand through Black worker power, right, that this was an opportunity to build a new kind of labor movement that could center racial justice and economic justice. And that's been the work that we've been engaged in over these last 12 years, building a movement that brings racial justice and economic justice together.
Thank you so much, Lola, and for your amazing both vision and your just incredible organizing and leadership. Jen, you and the amazing sisters of the National Domestic Workers Alliance have always grounded us in the history of exclusion of domestic workers that also are very deeply based in the legacy of slavery and the undervaluing of women's work, but also with such incredible hope and inspiration and vision. Can you tell us about, Yes We Can, can you tell us about the origin story of Domestic Workers United, where you started in New York and NDWA, including this important expansion of contesting and building power in the narrative and hearts and minds domain?
Sure, and it's so great to be with you. Thank you for bringing us all together for this walk down memory lane, and so good to be with some of my colleagues who've been in this movement for so long and really laid the foundation for so much good work and worker power to be built. So there's actually a very long history of domestic worker organizing in the United States that way predates DWU or NDWA, really led and driven by Black women, and particularly Black women in the South, dating all the way back to the first washerwomen's strike in Atlanta, Georgia in 1881 that raised wages for thousands of Black domestic workers, actually multiracial group of domestic workers in the South, to Dorothy Bolden, who was a domestic worker and leader also from Atlanta in the civil rights movement and built the National Domestic Workers Union, which really did lay the groundwork for this, for our ability to imagine an organization that was powerful, that could advance the interests of domestic workers, and doing it in a way that was really embedded in the civil rights movement. And so it was a real model for us. And I would say that our generation of domestic worker organizing stands on all of that. And it also has specific roots in the immigrant community, in cities across the country. And in the mid-90s, in immigrant community centers and worker centers around the country, domestic workers began to break out of the isolation of this work, working behind closed doors in neighborhoods across the country, to work collectively, to share their stories and to begin to organize and to feel a sense of their collective power. And I was part of a group in New York City that was starting to organize, which had its roots in the South Asian community and in the Filipino community. And in 2000 became a multiracial domestic workers organization with the founding of Domestic Workers United, with a huge amount of leadership from Caribbean immigrant women in Domestic Workers United. And parallel to the process of Domestic Workers United organizing and building and really trying to understand what it looks like to improve conditions and raise standards, there were similar efforts happening around the country, and we started to learn about each other and hear about each other, and we started to reach out to each other. And in 2006, 2007, early 2007, we decided to come together to organize the first national meeting of domestic workers at the U.S. Social Forum in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was there that 50 domestic workers and organizers from 6 cities and 12 different organizations came together and launched the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And in our DNA was this idea that we would be a multiracial, multilingual, multicultural organization that was rooted in local organizing. And in fact, most of our early years were about supporting each other's local efforts to build power and strategize our obstacles, and really about mutual translocal support for organizing, which continues to this day. Cultural work was really important to us: music, dance, poetry. We had already launched the New York Domestic Worker Bill of Rights campaign, which was the first campaign in the country to establish labor standards at the state level for domestic workers, and really take on this legacy exclusion of domestic workers from our labor laws, an exclusion deeply rooted in the history of slavery and structural racism in our economy. And because of that, racial justice and immigrant rights were just deeply embedded in our DNA as a movement. Domestic work is also the sector of the economy with the largest concentration of undocumented workers of any part of our labor market. And so the kind of domestic workers movement was always a movement of many movements. And because of the disaggregation of our work hidden behind many, many closed doors across the country, and the way that this work was kind of culturally devalued and associated with women and women of color who were seen as less than real workers, right? The work is still referred to as help. We had to be very creative about how we organized and built power, and we had to really take on changing cultural norms and narratives. We had to figure out how we leveraged media narrative, culture change work with this legislative and policy campaigning, with innovation and using every tool at our disposal, including new technologies, to help us organize, to help us imagine reaching millions of workers hidden behind closed doors. So creativity and figuring out how we can build power in any and all ways became our model. And in the last 5 years, we've also really leaned into building civic power, understanding that domestic workers, like so many working class women of color, have not been supported to be powerful in our politics in this country. And we need to build the infrastructure for that to happen. So that is what we've been doing.
Thank you, Jen. And luckily we get to hear from you a little bit more in the next panel. So thank you for that framing and the amazing strategies. Sarita, you have the final word on this panel. And I want you to pick up a little bit from these threads and what you talked about the important work that you and J have played in building alignment and strategy at the intersections of worker centers and unions. And insights from that, and what do we need to understand for the future?
Definitely. Thanks so much, Laine. And this panel has been amazing, and I'm so glad to be reunited with my friends in this way. So I'll try to be really quick, knowing we want to get to the other panels. So Jobs of Justice has played a really critical role, sometimes very visibly, but more often than not, very much behind the scenes. And what that's required to build a kind of alignment has been a few things. One, being a really strong partner to the worker center movement. And there's different ways in which Jobs of Justice has done that. Many local J coalitions seeded and housed worker centers for a few years until they could thrive independently. This was actually my own experience as an organizer in Chicago. And actually, this is how I met Pablo, was through the work in seeding the first worker center in the city. And J coalitions have been spaces where worker center leaders and organizers could meet and cultivate relationships with labor. And this was especially important in the first decade, before much of labor was actually interested in building with this emerging movement. It's also required serving as a bridge between worker center and labor movement. And we were very well positioned to do this since we were trusted partners for both. But what I mean by bridge for a second is serving as an interpreter across very different cultures. The culture of the labor movement is very different than the culture of the worker center movement. Creating spaces to share stories, experiences, and commonalities between between union members and worker center members, whether it was workshops and conferences or actions, building a shared analysis, like making a connection between globalization and migration and immigration and bargaining rights was really important. And then bringing in this analysis of historically excluded workers. And then finally, like designing actual solidarity actions and campaigns that were about creating the transformative experiences for workers of standing together, whether it was day laborers supporting workers on the picket line, union workers on the picket line, or union members supporting domestic workers. It was important to do that work. And then finally, spearheading campaigns that were expressions of the labor movement, the broader worker movement we want and need. And you'll hear more about these in the subsequent panels. All of this to say that this work is messy, it's tension-filled, sometimes not so fun, and a lot of work. But this type of aligning and weaving is so necessary to build for our collective future. And that brings me to the two insights. Quickly, one, that we have to be intentional about how we want these partnerships to evolve over time. This first couple of decades was about supporting one another and building relationships, but now it's about really building power together. And that means we have to be thick-skinned in managing the differences and working through the tensions. And my second insight to offer is that the worker center movement itself has also needed its own space to learn, grow, and collaborate across sectors. And just as Aijen was talking about the US Social Forum in 2007 and domestic workers coming together in 2010, all of us were a part of building the United Workers Congress, and many reasons and history behind why we all came together across so many different sectors. But my big takeaway from that is we need these generative spaces at multiple levels, national, local, regional. We need to be nimble and evolve our strategies and create these new formations. And finally, we need to lean into the intersectionality approach, because worker centers have modeled how we can get this right for the broader worker movement.
Thank you so much for that, for this amazing first part of our story. I want to just appreciate all of you for your insights and for your incredible work, and that of the members that I know each of you all are working with and speaking through right now. So I'm going to now turn, and magically, some of you are going to say Aijen and Pablo, and some of you are going to leave, and others are going to come on. Thank you to the people behind the screen. And we're going to turn to the next panel, focused on new terrains of worker organizing. And I'm happy to welcome Erica Smiley of Jobs with Justice, and Aijen, who we get to hear more from, Andrea Dellendorf of United for Respect, and Sekou Sibi from Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, and Jennifer, otherwise known as JJ Rosenbaum from Global Labor Justice, International Labor Rights Forum, and also for Repeat Performance, Pablo. So starting with you, Smiley. Do I see you, Smiley? Yes. Hi. I want to focus on new frameworks and strategies that are expanding collective bargaining for workers, those that have been traditionally excluded, or were existing types of collective bargaining that we traditionally know are increasingly challenging. So first of all, because you're so good at this, help us just even understand what this means, like particularly within the context of a conversation of worker centers. And if you have a few directions, a few examples, what you see as promising, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. No, this is great. I'm so glad to be part of this. And it is kind of a really heartwarming reunion to see and be reunited with a lot of these folks in the same space. I'm having all kinds of emotions and feelings around it. But I'll just try to be brief and play my part well. That really the role that Jobs for Justice has played, in addition to what Sarita laid out earlier, is to really elevate some of the new forms and traditions of collective bargaining that worker centers and many unions have been testing. And I want to anchor the framework that I'm going to lay out in the context of democracy, because a lot of people have really created these really specific silos around what collective bargaining is. This idea that that's like collective bargaining is a thing that unions do in the workplace around wages, and worker centers are community groups that kind of have worker members and fight for standards in the community and that kind of thing. But it's actually much broader than that. And I like to take it all the way back to Reconstruction to talk about, because I feel like that's the last part in our history where we were united in trying to build a multiracial democracy, right? You had like about abolition of slavery and forced labor. You had defining of citizenship and the freedom to vote, right? And our movements have been fighting for those things, and our opposition has been trying to limit them. And the worker center movement over the past couple of decades has actually been a key force in trying to actualize several of those constitutional amendments, particularly around citizenship and around the right to work without forced labor and to be able to control our labor. And so I say that because when we talk about collective bargaining, we aren't just talking about this narrow thing that a set of unions can do, but actually you're trying to talk about what it would take to actualize democracy in the economic arena, to actually have the majority of people in any given situation, workplace, industry, or market to be able to have some form of direct governance over that industry, sector, company, or market. And this is actually where the role of worker centers in particular has been very unique, because the freedom and flexibility to operate from a community perspective and standpoint has allowed the ability to see that vision, to see the opportunities of how to negotiate with capital. So at Jobs with Justice, we've categorized this into three main areas. The first one being expanded versions of traditional collective bargaining. This is kind of like social movement bargaining, or even as the Carmano Center is like coined recently, like bargaining for the common good. And this is where an existing union can expand the scope of what they're trying to negotiate over with an employer to issues with their community partners or other stakeholders. And a great example of this are the teachers in St. Paul, Minnesota, who built power with community allies and parents and students in a way to be able to insert into collective bargaining negotiations, into their existing contract negotiations, the goals of not having evictions or deportations during the school year. It's something that's not necessarily noted as a mandatory bargaining topic in the NLRA, but it's something that they were able to build power to force into the discussion, to see contract negotiations as a site of democratic struggle, not just as something to like deal with their regular personnel issues. The second area is this idea of bargaining with the ultimate profiteer, or with the 1/10 of the 1%, as Saket Soni and Stephen Lerner have said in the past, right? Where if you've read David Weil's book on the fidget economy, you totally get this, where you see over the last, several decades, global capital has transformed the workplace to basically socialize all risk and privatize all profits and benefit at the top. And so, whether it's through fissuring, misclassification, subcontracting, or moving, literally transplanting companies to places, whether it's the US South or the global South, where they can pay workers less, to create a situation where it's hard to understand who your real boss may be. And so the theory here is actually to try to organize bargaining units across sector, across union and worker center, across geography, to negotiate with the ultimate benefactor, the ultimate profiteer. And, Saket, who coined the phrase, I think the National Guest Worker Alliance is one of my favorite examples of this, when they organized guest workers from CJ Seafood and small little shrimp supplier in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, to actually negotiate directly with the biggest supplier, right, with Walmart and Sam's Club in Arkansas, and to actually make some gains. And even Andrea, who's going to speak soon here, with the work that United for Respect was able to do with Toys R Us workers, going directly after the money managers and the hedge funds that were bankrupting that retail company, not just thinking about whoever's signing that paycheck. The last thing is I know I'm short on time, so I'll just be very brief. The last thing is just community-driven strategies towards collective bargaining. This idea that why should we have just one place to negotiate a contract? Why can't we actually negotiate all of our economic relationships, and whether it's as a tenant or as a debtor with a bank, or as a worker? And so groups like the Crown Heights Tenants Union, like organizing buildings as locals, targeting a set of building owners that, as far as they know, they're just LLC fill in the blank, but in fact have outsized power over a real estate market, and treating that as treating collective bargaining as a way to set standards and enforce those standards, instead of just waiting on policy in the government. And so in many ways, worker centers and many of the people that we're listening to today have been in prime position and poised position to actually experiment with these strategies. And we should see them not just as economic justice as community organizing, as social movement, but actually as an evolution of, along with some traditional unions, an evolution of labor strategies for the 21st century.
And I think we're going to hit up on a lot of the things that you're bringing up in some of the examples in the next few speakers. So thanks so much for that. Jen, I want to give the word back to you to sort of pick up where you were going in the first panel. And if you can just talk about what has expanded bargaining in your sector, which is traditionally excluded from bargaining, actually meant and looked like.
I mean, essentially having an organization that is focused on organizing workers first and foremost, and has at its center of all of its strategies, organizing workers, allows you to then be creative and think about how you deploy the power of workers in multiple arenas, whether it's fighting for the media and cultural narrative, whether it's fighting for control over more capital and resources and the ability to direct labor markets, or whether it's fighting to pass policy, or it's fighting to mobilize workers to the polls. That we want to be thinking about and working along multiple dimensions of power, and having worker organizing at the center allows you to do that. And one of the things we've tried to figure out is, how do we actually structure a mechanism for workers to be at the table in a different way? And one of the experiments in that is our Seattle Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, where we were able to create a domestic workers standards board that brought together the city, representatives of employers, and worker representatives to be at the table together to talk about what labor standards in the city of Seattle for domestic workers should look like. And that is starting to move towards concrete changes. So I think it's about putting workers at the center of multiple strategies to build power, figuring out how you structure a seat at the table, and also being rooted in the specific dynamics of your sector. Right now, we're doing some really exciting work with SEIU, with family caregivers, with disability rights organizations, and consumer groups, older adult groups, through the campaign Caring Across Generations, and multiple efforts to try to have a care sector-wide strategy that's in the interests of both families who need care and services, and improving jobs and conditions for the workers, and thinking about how the workforce is a part of a larger story about what we need as working families, and how can we aggregate and build power that way. That comes from being specifically rooted in our sector, and also having really great partnerships with unions and organizations representing disability justice interests and consumer interests. So like that.
Thank you, Jen. I have been told by the people behind the screen that I'm muffled. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. For those of you on the panel who I can see, if you can't hear me, just start waving frantically. Thanks so much, Jen, for that. And again, I've just been amazed, and you have proved so many people wrong who said organizing power for domestic workers would never be possible. And we're seeing it now on the front pages and in the federal administration because of the courage and the vision of you and your members. So thank you. So I want to turn to Andrea and Sibi now to talk about how they're thinking about and engaging in strategies to influence not only policy, but also corporate and financial actors that are shaping the terms of the economy, and particularly in the sectors they focus on of retail and restaurants. So Andrea, can you help frame this out for us? Particularly as you're taking on some of the biggest behemoths, Walmart and Amazon. Any lessons learned for the rest of us?
Thank you, Laine. Just an honor to be part of this discussion with such incredible movement leaders. So for us, we do work within the retail sector, and our big picture vision is how do we fundamentally transform and change the conditions and really redistribute both power and resources into the hands of working people over their sector and where they work. And because of the retail sector, and this is happening across the economy, but in each sector in a particular way, concentrated corporate power and the power and the role of the finance sector in dictating what the terms are for how people work, and really driving income instability, workplace and economic instability. They have just been absolutely critical forces. And there really is not a strategy to change and address what is happening in the 16 million person retail sector without dealing with concentrated corporate power and financial actors. We just can't make the kinds of changes that we need to make. And there are really, three overlapping trends that we're seeing that have been happening over the last decades. One is corporate concentration. The first cycle of this was really with Walmart, where they not just created a complete sea change in the retail sector, but also just completely bottomed out US manufacturing, as we all know. And now we're seeing really round two of this with Amazon in terms of just the astounding level of public and economic power and monopoly power that they have consolidated. So there's, one trend. And so it means that, about, really significant, almost a quarter of the entire retail sector is now within those two mega corporations. And that doesn't even really, account for all of the subsidiary workers that aren't considered directly in the retail sector, but are influenced by those two employers. The second major trend is financialization, where increasingly, whether it's through the extractive investments of private equity firms and hedge funds, or if it's just the crazy logic of shareholder capitalism, where financial interest and return on investment, whether it's shareholder investment or whether it's private equity or hedge fund investment, is really driving the decision making of an increasing number of employers. So they've bought out huge swaths of small and medium-sized retailers. They're doing the same thing in the restaurant industry. I was shocked to hear it's like a third of the hotel industry is now owned by private equity. So it's really happening across sectors. And then the third being technologization, and how automation and technology is being used by those two concentrated forces to really drive down standards. So for us, the way that we go at this is we just have to go at it. And that, we have always had just a very clear strategy that we have to take on the big schoolyard bullies, who are the ones that are dictating what's happening to everybody else across the sector. And so our strategies are, we call it the unholy trinity: private equity, Walmart, and Amazon. And then we marry that with our public policy and political work, because what we find is that if we are able to change what a corporation does on their own through, workers taking action, changing the public conversation, like we did with paid leave with Walmart together with our partners, then they have a stake in not opposing the expansion of public policy that would then impact. And so there's both public policy that can be a guardrail to both these forces, and the ability to get corporations to do these policies voluntarily will neutralize them as opposition to be able to expand those policies. And so that's part of the two-part strategy here. The best example we have is the work that we did with Toys R Us, where, this was largely first told as a story of a hapless company trying to keep pace in a changing 21st century marketplace. But it turned out they weren't just not keeping pace, they had been bought out and were driven into bankruptcy by private equity firms. And so we, as Smiley laid out, we went straight to the purse strings and fought the private equity firms, and were able to win a pretty massive settlement of $1 million that came into the hands of, $20 million into the hands of those workers. But then also we're able to then build a public policy campaign to build severance, and then now the Stop Wall Street Looting Act that creates permanent guardrails, and working at a local state policy level. And we now have a group of Toys R Us workers who are on a mirror board of directors, meeting with the new Toys R Us that kept the IP to shape the future and have influence on the future of the company. And I think there are three lessons, right? We have to, we have to take on corporate power, and we need the capacities to do that, either as individual organizations or collectively. We also need to not just have corporate campaigns that support workers, but like how Smiley and Aijen laid out, have a much bigger social purpose and think about the multiple ways in which these entities are impacting workers and communities, and have a surround strategy that links those together around some shared interest. And then lastly, we just need more organizations doing it, more organizational muscle, more movement capacity, and more funding to be able to do this work. And just thank you all. Appreciate the time.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And just as you said, we just have to do it. So Sibi, we know that restaurant workers are up against one of the most powerful corporate actors in the National Restaurant Association. So what has this meant for ROC and your strategy, and the importance of engaging both corporate and business strategies, hybrid business strategies in your work?
Thank you very much for having me. I think my first organizing training has been done by Aijen many years ago when I started at ROC. So I'm very pleased to be among such a leader. I think we at ROC, we look at the data and we realize that the restaurant workers experience, for example, poverty at nearly 3 times the rate of worker overall. And workers of color experience poverty at about twice the rate of white workers. Given that, we also see that white workers are more likely to be interviewed and twice as likely to be hired as equally or better qualified workers of color applying to the same fine dining position. That goes to the root of racial and gender equity issues that ROC is fighting against. So we have developed for a long time a 3-pronged strategy. The first leg of the strategy is what we call a narrative shift. We have a narrative shift, we have an industry shift, and we also have a policy shifts. These are 3 core elements of ROC's strategy. Why do we find important to the narrative shift to go point to a disproportionate impact of low wage and a tipping wage on workers of color, women, immigrant? What we want to do at ROC is elevate workers' voices to change hearts and minds using digital campaign and social media strategies. We also want to amplify our work through multi-channel communication effort. But ROC is driving a narrative shift to expose and toxify the National Restaurant Association or the other NRA, right, which aggressively lobby the government to keep a federal minimum wage law at $7.25 for the past 10 years and at $2.13 for the past 30 years for tip workers. Clearly, the negative impact of NRA lobbying effort reverberates across industry all across. Because when restaurant workers' wage stays low, over industries pay the price too. This year alone, through community engagement and community enforcement, we were able to, gain more than $1.7 million in back wages because of that level of enforcement against corporation. But the element that's critical in those enforcement is the workplace justice campaign that we organize create a golden opportunity to collect a welfare narrative to support our policy and organizing agenda. Because through the workplace justice campaign, that's what we know what is going on to workers. The reality is when we want to promote their voices, we want to show how the issues are impacting their life, and this is what we can use to also move policy. Another element of our strategy is the industry shift. We have grown and raised our high road employee association to more than 900 members who support paid sick day, racial and gender equity, minimum wage increase, and one fair wage legislation. But a lot of people ask, why are you, ROC, interested in organizing employers, right? And our answer is because of a powerful trade lobby, that is the NRA. It is vital for organizations in retail and hospitality to prepare to answer this type of attack. For example, number one, they're saying the wage increase measure will lead to job loss. They also say the restaurant tip credit component will force the restaurant employees to lose money or end tipping altogether. They also say wage increase measure will bankrupt small businesses. And for us, wage increase campaign must feature both workers and small business owners, making raise a critical component of our industry shift. And the reason is the most important asset of any small business is the human capital, meaning the workers. So improving wages and working conditions is not only a moral imperative, but it is also a business necessity. We make the case that a good salary and better working condition will lead to employee job satisfaction, which increase the performance, and it is good for business. So therefore, for us, improving wages and working conditions is good for the working people. It is a win for employer who think strategically about the corporate social responsibility, which Andrea was talking about earlier. But we don't think that we can fight against every single restaurant out there. So we also need a policy shift. We support and catalyze policies that move industry standards and improve the life of workers. So at the foundation of RACSO policy is our research capability by producing more than 30 reports in the industry and becoming a resource center for over nonprofit organizations. So most importantly, we wanted advanced living wage policies tied to inflation. Although we're supporting $15 an hour, we don't think it is enough. We demand a complete wage with tip on top because tip are not wages, right? All tip earners, hospitality, delivery, nail salon, car wash, they all need a real wage and tip on top. Paid sick leave is something we fight for. Access to affordable childcare is something we fight for. Lastly, we also strategically invest our time in civic and political engagement activities such as voter mobilization and organizing ballot initiative as a way to shift the policy. We've organized a ballot initiative both in DC and in Michigan to increase the wages to $12 an hour. But in both cases, it failed. But it is our sense that a ballot is a people's tool to improve and defend democracy. But we have to realize that, as happened in Maine, a ballot that we win can be defeated because of a power and influence as a trade lobby such as NRA and others. So I want to thank you for.
Thank you so much, Sibi, for laying that out and for your amazing work. For me, RAC and Sibi have a particular important place in my heart, as they were among the first worker centers that I started working with now 20 years ago, as we commemorate the 9/11 and the work that you all really came out of that time developing, that has been just a sort of fierce and important champion for working people everywhere. Sibi, thank you. So this really sets you up well, JJ. JJ, you have been helping us really expand both our analysis of corporate power and our strategies for worker organizing beyond our borders. And this is a newer area for the worker center field, but in some ways brings us back to our origins of the worker center field. So help us understand this landscape, where you see particular promise for organizing it, and what are we aiming for there?
Thanks, Laine and Sarita. And this is really close to my heart, this conversation. When Sarita spoke about everything Jobs with Justice did to seed this movement, I was thinking about sleeping on the floor of their national office and how that, and so many other things. And so I'm just really honored to be here. And I really want to pick up the baton from Smiley on new forms of bargaining and from Andrea on how we beat corporations and investors and pass money back to workers. But before I do this, I want to take a small point, because this is a retrospective and historical moment. And also because I think in some other places, there's this notion that that global worker organizing and the global field is a new terrain. And I really want to ground that for worker centers, this has been a key part of the stories that have been told through by everyone so far and through the history. And I want to do that by pulling up some seats to the table of some of the worker leaders that have had a global vision from the beginning. Those are people like Juana Flores and Guillermina Castellanos with Mujeres Unidas and Activas, an affiliate of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which was a founding affiliate of the International Domestic Workers Alliance, who used an ILO process of the first Domestic Worker Convention to build a new global union federation of domestic workers, like attentive at the core to labor rights, gender justice, and labor migration. I want to pull up Saladin Mohammed with Black Workers for Justice in North Carolina, and now an affiliate of the National Black Workers Center, who in some of those very early meetings sat with all of us and talked about demanding ILO standards and showing how there were these international labor standards that could hold the US accountable for failure to provide public sector workers with collective bargaining rights. I want to pull up Mariel Gacho, the Congress of Day Laborers in the New Orleans Worker Center in Endelon, who was deported because of law enforcement cooperation with ICE and was a leader of a campaign which is foreshadowed many of the campaigns which Pablo will talk about now, about how people don't just disappear when they're deported. And in fact, from Honduras, led a fight with the sheriff to actually end immigration detainers in the South, in the city, and is now back as a leader of that organization. And also Olivia Guzman, a seafood worker who Smiley shouted out this campaign, who has led organizing and campaigns against multinational corporations from both the United States, from the National Guest Worker Alliance in Louisiana, and with Prodesk in Mexico, now building a worker center in Sinaloa that is organizing workers before they leave. And also Abhi Raju, an Indian energy sector worker who, as Hurricane Katrina is on many of our minds and hearts this week, demanded a different kind of reconstruction. And his family worked with Indian labor leaders from the Asia Floor Wage Alliance to also organize transnationally. So the strategy hub that we're building, I just want to give two insights. I know that we're short on time, but the first is that we can understand and put workers' hands on the architecture of the global economy that Andrea and Smiley were talking about: supply chains, capital markets, labor migration. And we can make demands broader than non-discrimination, and we can win them for actual redistribution and a difference. Fundamentally, I think of what Alfred Marshall, a New Orleans organizer, calls a saving wage, or what colleagues in Asia call a living wage or a floor wage. And second, that to do that, we have to engage in movement building on multiple levels. So campaigns that involve local unions, national, regional, global movement organizations. An example of this is the Justice for Jayshree campaign that is happening right now, where we have a sectoral union of Dalit garment workers leading a demand for bargaining and to expose what's really happening for women workers and make these good jobs, supported by the Asia Floor Wage Alliance and Global Labor Justice. We need more campaigns and more support for movement building at all of these levels. Also, for an example of work with STAS, the Sindicato de Trabajadores de la Agroindustria in Central America, which is demanding that job creation efforts in Central America are evaluated by whether they're good jobs and they allow unionization, and to demand immediate responses to retaliation and union busting. Those are just a few examples. We're building on the seeds and the power of much work that comes before us. So thank you.
Thanks so much, JJ, and thanks for bringing those incredible leaders into this space who have inspired so many of us and continue to do amazing work. Pablo, as I said, in many ways, your transnational work of Endelon with Corredores de Justicia in partnership with JJ and others, a transnational network of worker centers across the region is full circle. So tell us about this initiative and why it's important for Endelon's strategy to be building beyond the US borders.
Well, you know, this transnational initiative has developed in a very organic manner. The people who founded Endelon come from Central America, from Mexico, and South America. We came when we were young here, and we were trained in techniques of popular education, organizing in our home countries. And when we came here, we came with this wealth of knowledge that I think has enriched movements in this country. So as you know, the deportation machine has disrupted the lives of millions of people in this country, and particularly during the Obama administration, we saw those numbers go all like we have never had in more than a generation. So as we were defending people, trying to pass policies, protections at the local level, state level, sanctuary legislations to protect people, in some cases, I mean, we were some cases we were losing, in some cases we were winning. And for us, we didn't want to, think of the person who we couldn't win his or her case as a person that was gone. We knew that that person still existed. It was just somewhere else, So we began making that connection, following those folks. And we began talking to partners in those countries and having a series of exchanges. We went there, they came over here, and then we understood one thing, and that is that workers' rights don't end or start at the US-Mexico border or at any border, that before being immigrants, we are workers. And that wherever we go, we should carry those rights. Even if you're deported or if you come to the United States, those rights should go with you wherever you are. So we began talking with each other. We wanted to understand how they see the issue of migration from the South, because we had been here for a long time and we don't necessarily understand it anymore. So we began sharing ideas back and forth. And, as imperfect as the worker centers may be, because they are imperfect and there are many things that we have not accomplished yet, I believe that we have built a good model. And when folks from El Salvador, Honduras, and Mexico came to visit them, they liked the idea. And they said, this is the word that lately they've been using it. We want to tropicalize the idea. I want to make sure that we adapt it to our own circumstances here in our own countries. So these are some of the motivations why we decided to reach out, because there's a transnational family that is split. We need to unite that transnational family. We need to reintegrate workers who are deported, and we need to raise the standards, across the region in Central America. There's so many free trade agreements that have been negotiated and that I think will be renegotiated in the future. And we want to be able to have a voice, a regional voice, and not just in the US, but also in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Guatemala, and in Mexico. And so that's the idea of this network.
Thank you so much, Pablo. And clearly this is so incredibly important in this political moment and social moment to have that transnational and regional voice of workers really ensuring that the focus is on decent work and rights, not just on keeping people away or putting them away. So thank you. So thank you to this panel for all your insights and your amazing work and your part of the story. We are now rounding the corner to our last part of the story to focus on seizing the current political moment. We've been talking about that, but really landing that more, particularly economic, racial, awakening, economic justice, the awakening moment, and the new terrains for the field, given the major challenges and opportunities of technology and climate change. So I want to welcome our final discussion participants, or storytellers, if you will. Saru Jayaraman from One Fair Wage, Shanika Holder-White from the National Black Worker Center Network, Michelle Miller from coworker.org, and Saket Soni of Resilience Force. So Saru, hi. Starting with you and recognizing what an important role you have played over the last 2 decades in building this movement and this moment of great momentum for workers. Particularly administration, but also the moment for workers at the federal level and the demands workers are making for a more just economy.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Laine, and hi, everybody. It's nice to be with old friends. Thank you for pulling this gathering together. I agree with you. It is a moment of incredible potential for both policy change and worker power and worker leverage. It's kind of, I've been feeling like it's kind of an apex moment after 20 years of organizing in restaurants and the service sector. It's an apex moment for us. I know there are so many amazing people in this call who are experiencing other apex moments at the federal level, but it certainly is for us as well, because after fighting for the last decade to end the subminimum wage for tipped workers and other subminimum wages, which is a legacy of slavery and a source of sexual harassment, we're now experiencing a moment where both policy is shifting in our favor and the industry is shifting in our favor. So before the pandemic, this was a real issue. Low wages, horrible working conditions in our sector. With the pandemic, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. And we started a relief fund post-pandemic, and 250,000 workers applied. It was sort of like a gift from the universe. We immediately started organizing and surveying those workers. 63%, nearly 2/3, told us they didn't have any unemployment insurance because they were told their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. They said that tips were way down because sales were down, and health risks and sexual harassment were way up, with thousands of women reporting that they were repeatedly asked, take off your mask so that we can see how cute you are before we decide how much to tip you in restaurants. So we heard from, of the 250,000 workers who had come to us for relief, we heard from tens of thousands who said, we're not going to go back to work without one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top. And so hearing that, last year itself, we started organizing wage strikes, lots of wage strikes where workers were saying we're not going back to work without a full minimum wage. And that led, we believe, in part to Biden, as part of his campaign, actually announcing that, fully endorsing not just $15, but ending the subminimum wage for tipped workers, and then making that a part of the Raise the Wage Act, which was a key portion of his COVID relief package earlier this year. Of course, it didn't make it in the COVID relief package, but it continues to move. It's the first time that there's really been serious federal consideration of ending the subminimum wage for tipped workers and workers with disabilities. Huge moment, but it became an even bigger moment this year when states, governors, mayors allowed restaurants to reopen. And lo and behold, restaurants found what we had been saying for years, which is that workers are leaving. This is not enough money. Tips are down. Sexual harassment is up. So they found what they called a labor shortage, what we're calling a wage shortage, because we surveyed again the 250,000 workers. 53% of workers who remain in the industry say they're not going back. And 78% say the only thing that would make them go back, nearly 8 in 10 are saying the only thing that would make them go back is a living wage. And of course, this has led to thousands of restaurants across the country voluntarily raising their wages because they have no choice. It's the only way to get workers to come back to work. And we've started a huge documentation project of hundreds of restaurants across the country that have voluntarily raised their wages. This has led to state and local restaurant associations reaching out and saying, let's talk. It's time to actually talk about maybe making a deal, maybe working together to end the subminimum wage and win other things for workers. And it's that moment that led us to also work with elected officials in 6 states to create a program called High Road Kitchens, where we were actually providing relief also to restaurant owners who committed to paying a livable wage and going through a whole equity program. And since the leaders of that program were Julie Su, now Deputy Secretary of Labor, and Marty Walsh, now Secretary of Labor, we're also in talks with the federal government about making that a federal program. So whether or not we push this, raise the wage at the federal level, there is tremendous momentum to actually change the way things are. It's, like I said, an apex moment, but the biggest part of the apex moment is workers. That, all of this wouldn't have happened without workers over the last year and a half, basically saying, that's it, we're done. We're not putting up with this anymore. We actually evolved our relief fund. So we're now providing relief funds to workers who stay and fight, and we're providing them with training because so many workers are fighting, are organizing, are saying, we're not doing it anymore. And it is creating a moment of incredible power and leverage that we need to double down on, to invest on. We can't lose this moment of incredible opportunity.
Thank you so much, Saru. And I apologize to this panel because you are getting the last part of the story, and our minutes are closing towards the end of our 90 minutes. So I appreciate all your insights and your ability to be brief. Thank you. Shanika, so I want to turn to you in particular this moment to ensure that racial justice and economic justice are inextricably tied, as both Lola and Sarita talked about, is critical, and how you're focused on building Black worker organizing at the scale that's needed particularly reaching workers and communities in new ways, including young workers. Can you talk about your strategies and the moment we need to seize in the coming years?
Yeah, thank you, Laine. Hey, everyone. Thank you for having me on the panel today. I want to start off by answering that question just by sharing that one of the National Black Worker Center's 7 values, and also a value that you'll see at local centers, is courageous, authentic engagement. Engagement that is free from the exclusive toxic practices that allows organizations and people to benefit from Black culture but reject Black leadership, as well as freedom from white supremacy and harms and barriers that it promotes. When we talk about the Black movement and the energy that we're seeing from it right now, there is a militant joyfulness there that you see that accompanies this Black organizing, right? You see it when people are line dancing in the middle of protests or singing while waiting in line to vote. Dance, laughter, music in particular are tightly linked to the lives of their authors and have been a source of inspiration, a rallying call almost for change, and a means to advance social movements. And we're seeing that now, even more so than before. This form of militant joyfulness has been a source of resiliency and a main focus of our work, as well as you'll see it in other movements, right? You'll see it in the Black Lives Matter movement. You'll see it in the movement for Black lives. This culture creates a surge in engagement, allows movements to scale, right? You're seeing a lot of younger people, a lot more Black people becoming involved and engaged in the movement because of this like joyful militancy. There is no other way to build power. And I think we all know this, everyone that's been on the panel today know that there is no other way to build power than for and with Black people. And that starts with increasing and creating spaces where they can feel safe, right? And for them to authentically engage in their truest forms of themselves. What I know is that worker justice organizations and organizing practices aren't immune to adopting white supremacist culture. And that is what makes Black Worker Center organizing different, right? Folks don't have to hide who they are, what they think, how they express their emotions, their fears, their joys. We build safe spaces to share diversity of experiences and expression. Black culture in Black worker centers and Black movements is valued and required to sustain campaigns and movements. So in doing all of the above, those who engage with us, we're talking about young folks coming into this space, they have their experiences and their leadership abilities validated. It is of the utmost importance to tell untold stories and allow space for multidimensional and complex perspectives where Black people aren't reduced to stereotypes or to let the dominant narrative be about Black struggle, right? We at the National Black Worker Center speak in an authentic voice. It is obvious when messaging and strategy doesn't come from Black people, right? Because you simply just can't fake that. And so in order to scale the movement as a whole, it is extremely important to have Black worker centers and for the movement as a whole to really deeply invest in these spaces that allow Black folks to flock to it because it feels safe, it feels familiar, and they feel validated. Black-led, Black empowered organizations that provide this form of courageous, authentic engagement are necessary to the future of the movement. And that's because no one knows the economic crisis better than Black people, right? So we need to be at the helm of embedding the strategies in the plan to win. Sarita mentioned and said it so beautifully earlier, is that we have to build intentional partnerships and create generative spaces that lean into intersectional approaches. If you don't solve our problems, the problems of the Black community, of Black folks, their workspaces, no matter how small they may be, then your problems don't get better, right? So investing both through funding and partnership is solely the plan to win. And we need partners that truly want to see Black people win and who see their work as building with us and alongside us. I'll leave you with this, as I want to bring in the exclusion that sometimes happen in some of these spaces that prevents movements from getting to scale, right? And I want to leave you with this. The following scenarios can identify if a deeper dive is required. If you find yourself thinking or saying, well, we didn't need to specify race, right? Because the people who show up will be Black or brown anyways. That we didn't want to hear or we didn't want to have a Black focus because that would turn other people away. That if we specify race, we must include gender, or that Black issues are too militant, because we hear that often. It's too militant for our organization, it's too militant for our movement. Or that fill in the blanks, right? With, say, wage theft is more of a primary issue than wage equity. If you can relate to any of those, then you may be excluding Black people from the very spaces that their leadership is most needed. Not addressing this form of institutional blind spots that perpetuate inequity will ultimately prevent us from achieving what we should all be working towards, right? Which is putting ourselves out of business. So creating these forms of comfortable spaces and safe spaces where Black people feel seen, heard, validated, and can express themselves with their true authenticity is what really grows the movement and the strategy that we employ to bring young people, bring Black people, and really grow the movement to fight and win change.
Thank you so much, Shanika, for all of that, and particularly to uplift the importance of authentic leadership of Black workers and communities, and also to make sure as we move forward, we embrace both the struggle, but also the joy in our strategies and our organizing. Michelle, okay, very quickly, you break down really complex things for us in very short bites, and I appreciate that because you've really helped us to understand the way technology and data is shaping the nature of work and our strategies for worker organizing. Can you give us in, a few minutes or less, what are the most dimensions of this for us to be grappling with right now and in the years to come?
Thank you, Laine, and thank you for including us in this incredible group of visionary leaders. So yeah, over the past few years, coworkers been engaged in a real investigation of the role that technology is playing in our economics, our politics, and our culture. And what we know is that technology companies and technology platforms are the dominant means at this point through which people interact with all of those systems. And they are often the ways that we use to structure our lives and our relationships to major institutions, which is demonstrated by the fact that people are watching this on YouTube right now. And as you are watching this on YouTube right now, Google and Alphabet, the parent company of Google, are collecting data on you and everybody else who is participating in this conversation. All of these platforms and all of the technology that we interact with right now is built on extraction of data and manipulation of behavior to keep you coming back to that platform. They were originally built to extract our data so as to sell us ads. They are now built to extract that data to both sell us ads and try to build better automated systems and sell artificial intelligence. And so what does that have to do precisely with the workplace? Many of those technologies that we're seeing showing up in workplaces that are monitoring productivity, that are monitoring our behavior and our facial expressions, that are monitoring our wellness and health and safety, are built on the same logic of endless surveillance and extraction. And they are also being inserted into the economy that Laine and Smiley and Andrea described, that is increasingly fissured and increasingly dominated by just a few corporate actors at the top. So what this means is that they are able to increase control over workers at the individual level, and that they are able to do that built on systems that because they were created on existing data that contained biases specifically against people of color and also against women and queer people, exacerbate and cover up inequality that is already present in our economy. They also create this kind of opacity around power and decision-making and make it very difficult for workers to actually identify and contest decisions that are made by these systems. But there have been some growing organizing efforts by workers within these systems that shed a little light on what's possible. At United for Respect and in the Athena Coalition, there's been a lot of organizing by people in retail and warehouses to collect information about the way that automation is impacting those workers. We've seen a growing number of campaigns on coworker in which workers, specifically workers in the gig economy who sort of experience this at an accelerated level, are identifying elements of platform work and algorithmic management as areas of contestation. So led by a worker named Willie Solis, Shipt shoppers who work for Target on their app, organized to collect data to prove wage cuts were happening on their platform, and then coordinated this through digital platforms and using digital tools that are also created by these same companies that we are protesting against. And so it's a mixed bag, but the Shipt shoppers were able to prove that their wages were being cut by about 40% on the app over time. And this was something that when they brought it to Shipt was denying entirely. So in this context of sort of increased power of these companies and increased control over people's individual lives, there is also this growing momentum for organizing, not just inside workplaces, but around concentrated power in the economy. And I'll just leave this by saying a lot of the work that we've done recently has been to sort of build on that momentum and support worker-led organizing across the tech sector through our Solidarity Fund and in the economy. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle, so much. Saket, you're going to take us home for real. And I just appreciate all of the audience members who have hung through, and I think at every bit of the story, and invite you to stay just for a few more minutes for Saket's final conversation. Saket has always been sort of at the forefront of pushing our movement to see what's around the corner. And at this point, Saket, you are taking on one of the biggest challenges of climate change. So please do tell us, what is the opportunity in this movement, in this moment, you know, particularly stemming from your insights coming, you know, out of Katrina, and as we experience the things we're experiencing right now with Ida and beyond.
Thanks, Laine, and thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, that's the question. I mean, what does the future hold for workers and worker power? Every American era has newly recognized workers. There was a time when the stern Iowa farmer-daughter pair in American Gothic were new. There was a time when Rosie Riveter was a newly recognized worker. These were new workers in the agricultural and manufacturing eras. In the last 2 decades, because of the movements that we've heard about today, newly recognized workers have included building cleaners, care workers in Atlanta, migrant day laborers in New Orleans. At the beginning of the pandemic, we cheered from balconies for another newly recognized kind of worker. Millions applauded essential workers. So it's not always the workers who are new, but our culture, our politics, our imagination creates new moments of recognition that turn people into icons and change the future for workers. This usually happens when big forces create new economies, and one of those forces today is climate change. We've just seen what happened in Louisiana. We're living in an era where storms, fires, floods are more frequent, more destructive, and that's creating a new economy. It's a force bigger than the federal government. Climate change is a force that will be with us for a very long time, and it's changing our world. It's creating a world where homes, schools, streets need to be stronger, more resilient to face the next disaster. It's creating a world in which most of our American infrastructure, most of our built environment will have to be rebuilt. And who's going to do that? That is creating a new economy. We call this the resilience economy. And inside of it, there are billions of dollars circulating. And there are tens and thousands of new workers who we need to protect and secure so that they can rebuild, not only after disasters, but rebuild day in and day out so that all of us can be more secure to face the next 10 years and 20 years of climate change. It's just an example, but it's a real one. It'll play out in the next 3 months in Louisiana. Tens of thousands of workers will come there. They will rebuild roads and schools. They'll be the ones ensuring that half the tax base of an American city doesn't just leave. It's going to be the difference between the future for an American region and no future for that American region. And I'm talking about it today because in the context of the worker center movement, it's important to understand that whenever new workers arrive and whenever new economies open up, whenever new frontiers are created by huge forces bigger than us, it's the worker center movement that steps in to organize the future of work. That's how it was in phases that you've heard described today. That's how it's going to be in the next 10 years, 20 years as climate change shapes our American environment. So I invite you all to join us at Resilience Force, be in solidarity with these workers, women workers, Black workers, migrants, transnational workers who are rebuilding our future in the face of climate change and who are bargaining for a different future for all workers. Thank you, Laine and Sarita, for organizing us. Thank you all for the heroic work you're all doing in your sectors, in your parts of the economy. And for the audience, this is a hopeful moment, a moment of profound opening, but we need to organize in politics, in culture, and in the economy to secure the future that all workers need in the face of democracy, the future of democracy, and the future of climate change. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Saket. I could not have said that better in terms of both what's at stake and what the opportunity and the optimism we should have right now in a moment where workers are in motion everywhere, and the support for workers and workers' organization is at the ultimate all-time high, and we have leadership that wants to support that. So now is the moment to seize. I want to thank you to this panel and to all our discussion participants, and thank you to the countless other local organizers and leaders, national organizers and leaders, and particularly the worker members that we were unable to hear from today, but who are making what seems impossible possible. We honor you all, particularly as we edge towards Labor Day. If you want to learn more about the Worker Center movement, we are pleased to announce the launch of the Worker Center Library. Again, that will be housed at QED at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Thank you, Harold, for clarifying that. And please see in the chat the link to that. Check it out, but also contribute to it. And to you all who joined us tonight and even stayed a few minutes over, thank you for joining us. A huge appreciation to OSF's co-sponsors of this event and collaborators in supporting this movement, Ford Foundation, American Prospect, and QED.